When you look at the old globe here, what is it that you see? I'll tell you what you see. You see blocs, unions, and regional superpowers, a distinctive lack of vibes, as far as the eye can see. Wankers. In the East, we have the hyper-capitalist communists. Now, I don't quite get it either, but I hope you like the food, because you'll be eating a lot of it in the concentration camps. These lads are not fucking about.
And I, for one, welcome our new insect overlords.
In the North, we have the Adidas-clad house elf horde. Not much to say about this lot. Their only purpose is to be the pantomime villain and to give the rest of the world, even the Belgians, if you can believe it, a collective sense of patriotism and identity in opposition to their rat fuckery, and we thank them for it. Over in Europe, we have the well-meaning but ultimately gay and useless empire, the rainbow parking badge Holy Roman Empire. I'm allowed to make that joke. One of my mothers is disabled and she got me express permission from the Council of Gay Cripples. Yes, that is how it works. They have tremendous potential, but whenever they have a bright idea that might be of some benefit to the world, they're kneecapped by a single Hungarian man called Tim shouting racial obscenities into the void.
Snap the thumb and forefinger off of every single person I see who I think resembles the kind of wanker that'll be walking around in this day and fucking age with the name like fucking Tim.
Then if we swing over to the barbarous colonies of the New World, we have... Okay, well, at time of recording, I'm still pretty unsure what it is exactly we're looking at here. But for anybody watching in the future, we're currently on the episode of the news where it looks like they're about to invade Eskimo Island for untapped natural resources revealed by sciences the administration previously denied the existence of, so that's a pretty cute plotline. And if we just zoom out here, spread across these spheres of influence, there are 4 nations that find themselves, as a result of recent world events, isolated and threatened, but uniquely and extensively aligned by more than just circumstance. Quote, the Canzuk nations share the same majority language, the same sovereign, the same Westminster-style parliamentary system, the same common law legal system, the same respect for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, and the same westernized culture. We are virtually the same people with only the cover of our passports dividing us.
I'll fucking do it again.
So let's start off with everybody's favourite seal-clubbing, syrup-shagging, eldest-born bastard love child of history's greatest rivalry. Canada.
Just to see its little head just coming out of that dog's pussy.
Until very recent events, the idea of this union was nothing more than a subject for 2 Bob journalists with writer's block. You know, YouTube videos with overly dramatic titles, a wet dream for a certain type of nostalgic imperialist that with the absence of God needs something bigger to affix his hopes and dreams, but doesn't have the good sense for that to be his local football club, like the rest of us normal, healthy, civilized monkeys. However, the reality of this union, in just the space of a few weeks, it doesn't seem that mad all of a sudden. It actually looks quite appealing and realistic.
Canada is ready to take a leadership role in building a coalition of like-minded countries who share our values.
Now, the United States' recent antagonism towards Canada is the key event that changes this cute little idea into a potential reality. You see, Canada, it seems to me, has always been the most important piece of this union, given their economic integration and dependence on the United States, much like New Zealand to Australia, has always made this basically impossible. Why would Canada prioritize these far-flung mates over the warm teat of their extremely hot, abusive muscle mummy? And this is a predicament that is shared by each respective nation of this proposed union, but Canada finds itself in the vanguard, facing threats from the nation that had been overwhelmingly responsible for their security. It's a tremendously precarious position to be in. Now, I like eggs just as much as the next man, I really do, but would I dismantle my own empire and the sum total of my nation's foreign policy achievements because they started to get a bit expensive? Probably not, and that's not just because my brother keeps more chickens than he knows what to do with. I can't get through them fast enough, is the God's honest truth.
I offer you a nice egg in this trying time.
Now, the basis of this empire, in a nutshell, is as such. We, the United States, possess ungodly military capabilities, and we have it in our power to guarantee your protection. Now, this gives us massive amounts of influence over you in regard to trade, politics, intelligence, and global military accessibility. And in return, you get to focus on a robust welfare state and a quality of life from which heights you can look down your noses at us. How does that sound? Now, this offer was pretty good to a Western world broken by 2 world wars, and if this subject interests you, I talk about it a little further in my video on American isolationism. That is, if you can spare the loss of brain cells. However, after the United States' sudden and seemingly schizophrenic change in rhetoric and the abrupt pulling of this security rug, their allies, if that's still the appropriate word to use, have found it incredibly jarring to be suddenly met with hostility for participating in a model of America's own creation, without so much as a suggestion of a transitional period for a coordinated American military withdrawal, which under better circumstances and execution would be a perfectly reasonable thing for an American voter and taxpayer to desire. But it's under these volatile circumstances that leads us to the argument for militaristic independence.
One army, a real army, united behind one leader with one purpose.
Now, by all rights, these lads should never have got off the ground. A nation built and raised by sunburnt cockneys in what might as well be bloody Sothorios, their flora and fauna the twisted conclusion of Valyrian blood magic. Needless to say, they should not be a functioning nation, let alone a prospering top 15 global economy. Fuck knows how they've done it, but by Jove, the crocodile-shagging mad bastards have pulled it off.
There's one under here.
However, these chaps and chapesses are not without their fuckery. You see, in the year of our Lord, Horatio Nelson, 2021, Australia exercised the God-given right afforded to any good-humoured Anglo nation and terminated their deal to purchase French Baguette-class submarines, instead moving toward a far more comprehensive naval agreement with the UK and the US, the AUKUS agreement.
Oh, hey, Yoko Ono and the 2 remaining Beatles, piss off.
Now, at first, this seemed like the right decision, not least because it pissed off the French, which is always good crack, but because an advanced level of security in the face of China seemed like a more long-term, comprehensive solution. However, just the same as Canada and the rest of the nations under the United States security umbrella, that was until recent events.
The Australians and the Brits will be discussing AUKUS with the Prime Minister, sir.
What does that mean?
You see, the Chinese have frequently been sending military vessels to circumnavigate Australia. Why? Because they can, a probe, a show of strength, and presumably to inspire their own brand of rum, so criminally affordable as to make a hopeless alcoholic of any man
Or woman.
in these godforsaken times. The purpose of these provocative exercises is to observe the reaction of Australia and its allies, most notably the United States. You know, how far are they willing to go to defend their allies? Now, the problem here is that firstly, these submarines won't be finished and delivered for about 15 years, and the uncertainties of the current administration's behaviour toward their allies does not leave Australia in a particularly secure position. And who's to say these submarines won't receive the F-47 treatment?
Well, the front fell off in this case by all means, but it's very unusual.
And even if there is no shithousery, no silly buggers, no tomfoolery, these submarines still rely on the United States in perpetuity. They can only be refurbished and repaired in American naval bases. They are, after all, American-made, a problem shared by the UK, included in this very same AUKUS agreement. Now, events in Canada provide us with a more general geopolitical example of reasoning for this union. Events in Australia provide us with the realization and importance of independent military capabilities and industry. Now, to build a military-industrial complex from the ground up is, well, complex. It's expensive, time-consuming, and it's not a particularly feasible achievement for any of these nations alone, without the over-reliance on any one of these already overpowering blocs. You know, you can't exactly hope to fire missiles at a nation who built their guidance systems, can you? But together, it's certainly possible, and by God does it create jobs, security, global influence, and require an ungodly amount of iron ore, which leads us to trade. But more importantly, it leads us to the unique, secret ingredient, the glue, the fuel on which this union relies upon more than any other commodity. Pure, unadulterated vibes.
Oh, that's my undies.
Now, if you've watched any of my videos before, you might have picked up on the fact that my favourite story of all time is The Lord of the Rings, and my favourite character from my favourite story is Pippin. And of this union, this Canzuk, this fellowship, they are our Pippin. They may not be equipped to do the most, but they will rise further to an occasion than any other. German engineering? Woke nonsense. What you want is sheep-shagging engineering. Now, I've got a good amount of Welsh in me, so I'm not here to kink-shame, but just have a look at this, will ya? They had none of the capabilities and just said, fuck it, we ball. Here's a tractor with guns on it, proclaiming to the villains of the world, come on then, let's have it you two bob cunts, I'll take the lot of ya. Now, If that isn't the most Pippin thing you have ever seen, I don't quite know what is, and there's an indomitability to that kind of national identity, and sometimes a bit of pride in a union is just as valuable as any other commodity. Now, I appreciate that I'm getting a bit lost in the sauce here, but that is my point. What they offer is raw sex appeal, vibes, and extensive natural resources. Now, I do realise this might sound trivial, and it's far from an academic argument, but academia is for nerds, maidenless shit stains and ratty goatee-wearing econ-pilled sex pests. What we care about is the vibes. Now, is there not great appeal in the idea of being a part of a union of countries that aren't cunts? Okay, so the Australians are kind of cunts, but they're good cunts. Amongst these nations, even the humour, let alone the bloody language, translates, and I don't think that can be understated. Now, this is a point I'll have to come back to a little later on, because unfortunately we have to cover the more boring, gay and trivial things, like trade and economy. Now, this is predominantly a history channel, and though I do like to talk about geopolitics now and again, I prefer to approach these subjects from a historical point of view, with the exception of this video, because that is my qualification. I don't really know shit about fuck when it comes to global economics, and I don't really feel like pretending to. Quite frankly, it bores me. It's a subject distinctively lacking in invasions of France. But it seems to me Australia, and by extension New Zealand, face a pretty stark economic threat in the face of China. You see, China buys a third of Australia's exports, giving them far more than a comfortable amount of influence over them. Now, Canzuk has been floated as a possible solution to this problem. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Tim Tams, seal blubber, and makeshift orc tractor tanks as much as the next man, but there is considerable, and I think fair, skepticism that trade between these nations wouldn't fill the gap left by China in the case of Australia and New Zealand, the EU in the case of the UK, or the United States in the case of Canada. But I think this misses the point a bit, even if I do think it's the strongest argument against it. The benefit of creating a more cohesive bloc allows for the opportunity to swing our collective dicks around a bit more. It gives you far more bargaining power. After all, it would be insane to follow the EU model of strict inclusivity in regard to their trade. With their combined influence, their military, and their global presence, they can strive for more beneficial trade without desperation or over-reliance. Now, after all, it's not just the Canzuk nations, but seemingly the entire world that's struggling with a housing crisis. Even in Australia, which is odd. I mean, I was led to believe by brain rot YouTube shorts that every second person over there was a tradie, so God knows what it is they're building, if it isn't houses, but either way, there is certainly a Canzuk and a global market for iron ore, Australia's main export. I mean, they three-tick mine this stuff like bloody Zezima in 2006. But if there is just two things worth knowing about China, it's that the quality of their food would be on par with the British if they didn't lace it with dolphin dandruff, and that there's actually quite a lot of them. It's like a really big Chinatown, if you can believe it. It's a pretty significant market that only requires the sacrifice of some of your most sacred moral values to participate in. However, trade isn't the only solution to this problem. Another benefit Canzuk proposes is free movement. You don't feel like paying $2 million to live in an East London skip? Well, move to Hobbiton. It's made out of sustainable materials, after all. A diversification of populations. What could possibly go wrong in a shared crisis of affordable housing?
I've been through my fair share of being called a pommy bastard, I can assure you.
However, a pooling of resources could seek to tackle this problem head-on. For example, in Australia, they make their houses predominantly from wood because you don't exactly want to trap heat when you live 3.5 miles from the surface of the sun and your seatbelts give you third-degree burns. And it just so happens that Canada suddenly has an ungodly surplus of timber, in addition to the Australians' potential for mass steel production. And in regard to the workforce, well, that's another benefit of free movement. Another is education. These countries have some tremendously prestigious educational institutions, aiding further cooperation in the arts and sciences, and so on. And again, these countries are an incredible fit for free movement. They share more or less the same average living wage and standards. Now, why is this good? Well, if we look at the EU, you will notice a lot more immigration from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, and sod all migration the other way around. It's not particularly balanced, because Western Europe is far wealthier and has far more opportunities for work. Now, this is obviously bad from an economic perspective, but it's also bad from a social perspective. This, as you can imagine, causes a bit of tension. It doesn't exactly help in regard to the division they already have. And there is already precedence for this. Australia and New Zealand already enjoy free trade and free movement. It's seen by those who are pro-Canzuk as a foundation from which to build this union on. So, is it economically viable?
Let's have a look at the answer, Prancer. Thanks.
Well, separate from Canzuk, it's kind of already happening as a result of America's global tariffs, with the gulag-deserving titled CPTPP, which sounds like a psychosis-inducing substance, if ever I've heard one. So, yeah, I reckon it's probably viable. And you're talking to the guy who once sold an evidently fake piece of Exodia in the playground for £5. Ignore what I said earlier on, I know everything there is to know about global economics, but is it the most economically viable path before us? Probably not. But keep in mind the thesis of this video. The economy is gay. Vibes are eternal. And who the fuck cares about the viability of it? Look at that land. That's a lot of land.
Adolf thought he did something for real skull emoji. However, bro got absolutely cooked by British forces.
So here we are, back at the scene of the crime. Mothership Zeta, His Majesty's United Kingdom, home to Shakespeare, Tolkien, and Barry 63. And that's his kill count, not his age.
Shall not pass!
Provider of national holidays the world over, no need to thank us. The International Millwall, Jerusalem. And speaking of independence, the eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed that the nations included are exclusively the white settler colonies of the British Empire. Now, why, for example, not Nigeria or India? And this has led to some people labeling the idea as a racist revival of the British Empire.
Have you guys written any songs?
No, I've been too busy with the race war. It's very time-consuming.
Now, on the surface, I kind of get that, but when you think about it for more than 30 seconds, you realise that of all the criticisms you could hurl at the idea, this is probably the dumbest one. I mean, if you want to be the one to ask India to get back into bed with the UK politically, be my guest, but I don't want to be in the room with you when you do it. Do you know what I mean? That's a defenestrating flying knee I've been looking to avoid my entire life.
I warned you not to make me use this. Now I'm using it!
But more importantly, the reason these are the nations in question is basically just due to the fact that they were populated and raised almost exclusively by the best and brightest island monkeys.
Ali! Oh, for fuck's sake! Fuck off, Ali!
They are, and I hope this doesn't sound too colonial of me, different interpretations of the same nation, providing them far more autonomy and quasi-independence following the American Revolution and the birth of the Second British Empire, something I discuss a little further in my George III video. Now, I don't mean to romantically brush over the genocides committed to achieve this, it's just hard to fit into a video with vibes as its central thesis without being too distasteful. But I do have a video in which I talk about that a little more seriously, but I might have to re-record and re-upload it.
This is Clem Fandango, can you hear me?
Who the fuck are you?
Because the audio quality was pretty piss in my first couple of videos. It's almost like I don't know what I'm doing, if you can believe it, almost. Now, don't get me wrong, they're each their own unique country with their own distinct national identities, but in terms of their values, the attractiveness of the population, their culture, their respective culinary achievements, their history, their extended average phallic girth, and their laws, they're very similar. The difference between them is comparable to that of Scotland and Wales, for example. It's tremendous, but at the same time, it's weirdly negligible.
Whales are fucking stupid. They're such cunts they can't even breathe underwater.
And this is, in my opinion, the most important aspect of this proposed union, the selling point. It's not a matter of being kin by blood, because who the fuck cares about that in terms of geopolitics? That'd just be a weird nationalistic circle jerk.
Communal masturbation.
It's the fact that we are kin by design. We're all nations built from the same schematic, the same blueprint, the same superior gene.
Vibes and racial supremacy.
Now, if you don't like the idea of constitutional monarchy, then I will maintain to my dying day that you are boring as fuck, but I definitely do get it.
There were two shots.
You see, this concept of a shared head of state is often sold as a pro, but it seems to me like it has the potential to be just as much of a con.
Pummy bastard.
As it stands, the similar living wage and standard, and to some extent the populations of these countries, is pretty workable, but the idea of a confederation seems a bit silly. It would give far too much power and centrality to the UK, and I don't say that out of altruism.
I'm a man of the people. Vox populi, vox dei.
I just don't think that it's the strength of this model. The unique model of this kind of union is the fact that it doesn't necessarily require centralized and singular leadership and direction.
Order!
because we already have that by default. It's kind of the whole point of the Union. It would just cause division. Now, the shared head of state thing is a bit tricky. From a British perspective, it's a pretty easy selling point. We're familiar with this office and what it means, a symbolic constant of our nation's collective histories, cultures, laws, and identities. A head of state that isn't hated by 50% of the electorate. After all, who the fuck wants to charge down a Chinese machine gun nest for a soulless politician on the opposite side of the culture war, rather than a 1,000-year magical concept of the national collective? Now, I'm not saying I want to die for the latter, but it's a lot more preferable than the former. You see, from the British perspective, it ties us together pretty inseparably, but I'm going to assume, and please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, that the good people of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand give far less of a shit and are probably far less comfortable with it, which is pretty understandable. However, and I'm pretty sure this isn't the most popular thing to say, but I'd rank Chuck pretty damn high on the vibe scale, personally, but I'm also incredibly biased here. The guy literally got me into university and shares my disdain of modern architecture, so do you know what I mean? I can't help but be at least a bit fond of the guy, so I'm probably not the person to expand on this particular argument. But as I say, regardless of your opinion on monarchy, we are tied together by far more important things.
Do it! Just
The idea of a union that is entirely on the same page in terms of domestic and foreign policy, pulling in the same direction, is kind of unprecedented. I mean, look at their UN voting records, and now look at the EU UN voting records. But you see, every time the EU looks like it might be of some benefit to the world, they are hamstrung by their internal divisions, millennial-old petty rivalries, different values, identities, laws, cultures, customs, languages, histories. They are loosely tied together by circumstantial geography and economic necessity. It's almost impossible for them to be anything more than a glorified trading bloc. An economically appealing trading bloc, but a trading bloc nonetheless. For example, in the face of the Russian threat and the exit of the United States, the EU is pumping nearly €1 trillion into remilitarizing, which all sounds very good and productive until you ask just one question, and everything implodes. Who leads it? The Germans, well, they don't exactly have the best track record.
Bro got absolutely cooked.
And that'll piss off the French, so the French, well, no, because that'd piss off just about everyone. The Belgians, well, need I say more? The Dutch are too tall for foxholes. The Italians, well, that joke just writes itself, doesn't it? And the Spanish haven't had a military victory for about 500 years. The Polish, they'd probably just use the opportunity to raise Berlin, leaving the Portuguese as the only viable option, but I do have a certain bias. Now, that's a bit of a silly oversimplification, and I'm sure leadership would be diversified, but you get my point. It's far from straightforward. And in regard to free movements, sure, the idea of seeing Europe can sound appealing, but take it from me, I've been to Europe and you don't want to go there. It's full of foreigners, they're everywhere over there, it's astounding, and they don't understand a word you say unless you shout it very slowly. There's no consideration for civilized folk. No, that's not the freedom of movement you want. The freedom of movement that you want is to Monkey Island. See our vast collection of rocks, domestic and stolen. Put money on the roo boxing. Can this contestant jaw this cunt before it drowns his dog? Well, that's for you to find out. Sick of haddock and cod as the only two options in your local chippy? Well, visit New Zealand and try whatever exotic Pacific fish they use there, something that's unironically on my bucket list. Can't find work? Well, go to British Columbia, put on women's clothing and hang around in bars. Now, I don't want to have too much of a go at the EU because I have quite complicated feelings about them. I have a lot of criticisms, but they're definitely not villains. They are just kneecapped to the extent of perpetually looking inward. They cannot hope to champion values they stand for throughout their own union, let alone stand up for them in the broader world. And with the US seemingly retreating into isolationism, this hands the wrong'uns of the world a pretty free hand to expand by force. Now, regardless, there have been talks as a result of recent events, particularly regarding Canada, for the EU to extend its member states outside of Europe as an alternative to Canzuk.
Gay is in, gay is hot. I want some gay, gay it's gonna be.
And as I mentioned at the start of this video, the geopolitical landscape is shifting into a world where the need for blocs and unions, particularly for smaller nations, is looking more and more necessary. If these are the options that lay before our collective nations, therein lies the question posed by Canzuk. Vibes versus economic realism. And there isn't necessarily a definitively correct answer, it just comes down to core beliefs and ideals. Do you believe that insular financial security and stability above all else lays the groundwork for you to have a comfortable and meaningful life, or do you want a balance between financial security and the idea of being a part of something as a nation, as a union, to have trajectory, agency, and a place in the world, values to fight for, promote, and defend? And when I say this, I don't mean to advocate for a bloody crusade or anything, as much as we are in need of one.
No, stop!
The number of Brummies multiplies year upon year without machine guns to direct them toward, and that just won't do now, will it? You can have too many Scousers, you know.
Exterminate, exterminate.
I mean more unifying in promotion of global free trade, as a random example, something these nations achieved in the 19th century. And with the nonsense trade tariff bollocks we see throughout the world today, that's something as a bloc you could realistically strive for, to see values you hold and believe to be universal benefits actualized into the world. After all, God is dead. Do not underestimate people's need to believe and be a part of something bigger than themselves.
Apes! Together! Strong!
Now, perhaps these things aren't as either or as I've put them, but you understand the point I'm making. You're a smart person, and your hair looks very nice today. I love what you've done with it. I mean, ideally, the vision for Canzuk includes incredibly close ties and collaboration with the EU, and to some extent, even the US. The Canzuk Union, as the UK already does, and more so with Canada, could act as the bridge between the EU and the US, and there's a decent amount of benefit in that position. And I think I would like to end the video on that note. There is very little left to be said about Canzuk. It's a pretty straightforward subject, but there's certainly a visible and renewed interest in the idea in the wake of recent events. And the point I wanted to make, and the reason I wanted to talk about it, was this question of vibes or economy. And that is the question.
To be or not to be, that is the question.
So please let me know what you reckon in the comments. There are buttons down below that fill my ego to a dangerous extent and get me ever closer to my dream of selling gambling to children. Thank you for watching. See you later.
And now for something completely different.
Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not personally mad about the name. It's good enough as a placeholder, I suppose, but it doesn't have the vibes required of such a wavy union. What about, Charlie's tractor shagging red, white and blues, the Fellowship, the Emu Empire, Margaret Thatcher's NSFW subreddit, the Chaps, the Leafwater Legends, the Mad Lads, the East India Trading Company, the Dirty Dustbins, Stephen Hawking's Rollerblades, the Four Skins, the Saviours of Gondor, Elbows Up to the Rectum, the Hooligans, Mr. Bean's Rule 34, the Distinguished Gentleman, Harry and his Bucket Full of Dinosaurs, the International Goon Squad, the Top Boys, the Jolly Good Fellows, the Nutsack Swingers, the Old Boys Network, Spider-Man 3, the Gifted Girth Graph, fuck this.